This video will explain the basics of cutting a facet in GemCut Studio, so this concept will be used as a basic building block for creating new designs. To perform a cut, there are a few variables that need to be set. Note that these can be changed at any time during the cut setup, can be changed in any order, and will reflect in real time on the various views. First, it's important to choose which side we're going to be cutting. This is done by pressing either the pavilion or crown button in the mask controls. The angle of our cut is set here. The value can either be directly typed into this edit field or set using the slider in either coarse mode or fine mode. Enabling fine mode changes the slider to a center detent and reset slider, which lets us change the angle with fine precision, but then when we let go, the slider snaps back to the middle, but our value isn't changed. So that lets us use the slider to keep going up and keep adjusting our angle. To go back to coarse mode, just unclick the fine button and our angle is unchanged. The depth slider is what brings in our cutting plane and actually makes the cut on the gem. To specify the number of facets and how they are arranged, we use the index gear settings. We've already set our index gear to 96. So this ruler here is the main ruler that controls our base index. The base index lines up with our cutting plane and is the first in our cuts if we've got a repeated symmetry. To change its value, click and drag the ruler side to side, or type in a value directly, or hover the mouse over the control and use the mouse wheel. The symmetry ruler determines the number of times our index gear is divided. If there's no mirroring, it also determines the number of facets that will be cut in the tier. The mirror ruler changes each symmetrical step into 2 facets, spaced equally apart, on either side of each symmetrical index. The spacing is measured in index increments. So if we increase our spacing, you can see our twin mirrored cutting planes are spaced further apart on the index wheel. Just to show what's meant by that these can be set in any order at any time, I can still modify my angle, my depth, my base index before I've even made the cut, and always see the result in my previews. It's much easier to understand these basic concepts by experimenting, so the next section will be exercises you can follow along to build up from a basic single cut to a complex mirrored symmetry. So to start, I'll reset the application by going into File, New. So we're going to start with a single cut. Observing a single facet is the best way to understand what's going on when the variables are changed. So to begin, let's bring the interface to a point where we're having only one facet being cut. We'll set the symmetry to 1. Make sure the mirror is set to 0. Let's set our masked angle to 45. And we'll bring the depth slider down until the cutting plane intersects the block in the design view. We can rotate to see that our cutting plane is now intersecting the block. Now, change the masked angle by using the angle slider. Notice the cutting plane angle changes to follow our slider, and this change is reflected in the design view, the instructions view, and our render view. Try experimenting with the fine mode to see how fine changes in angle are reflected. Now let's set our angle back to 45 for the next step. Change the base index by dragging the ruler in the index gear settings. Notice how changing the base index changes the position of our 45-degree cut along the index gear's axis of rotation. If we double-click inside the design view, that will show us in this case, a bottom view because we're cutting the pavilion, and how that cut relates to following the index gear. Be sure to set the index back to 96 or 0 for the next step. Now, while single cuts can be used to create a design, it can be tedious, especially when the intended result is to have multiple facets spaced apart on the index gear. For this, we use the symmetry control. Note that symmetry here applies only to the tier being cut and does not necessarily define the gem's final symmetry. Using the same 45-degree cut at a base angle of 0, increase symmetry by dragging the symmetry ruler. Notice that a symmetry of 2 creates 2 facets spaced on either side of the index gear's axis of rotation. A symmetry of 3 creates 3 facets spaced along the index gear's axis of rotation, etc. Now, some numbers on the symmetry ruler will be displayed as red. This indicates that there's no way to space the resulting facets along whole numbered index gear values. In this case, 96 isn't divisible by 9. So the index values will be rounded to the nearest whole number, resulting in an imperfect set of symmetric facets. Let's set our symmetry to 8, and while we've got that, let's modify our base index. Notice that we still have 8 facets, but now the set moves around the index gear's axis of rotation. If the value of the base index is greater than one of the resulting symmetric facets, it won't be shown as the first index in the instructions. Facet numbers are always ordered in ascending fashion. Let's go on to the mirror cut. In order to understand this more advanced cutting mode, let's go back to our single cut setup. We'll set our base index back to 0, symmetry to 1, and make sure mirror is set to 0. Set our mast angle to 45 degrees, and we'll bring the mast down to obtain a cut face on our cube again. Now we'll gradually increase mirroring by dragging the mirror ruler. Notice that as soon as the mirror is set to non-zero value, the single facet becomes 2 facets. The spacing index value is controlled by the mirror value. Notice that spacing can be visualized in the base index ruler. The active cutting index are shown on either side of the base index. Changing the mirroring changes the index spacing as a function of plus or minus. In this case, plus or minus 2 index values in relation to our base index of 96, so 2 and 94. It's important to understand that even though our base index is 96, performing this cut will not result in a facet at 96, but rather at the plus-minus value of 2 and 94. Now let's set our mirror value to 2, and now change the base index by dragging the base index ruler. Notice that the reference base index changes, and both mirrored facets follow, maintaining their spacing in relation to the base index. If we type in a value for base index, that'll be the value set here, and these will follow. Okay, now let's reintroduce symmetry, this time with mirroring enabled. So we'll set our base angle to 0, symmetry to 4, and mirror to 2. Make sure the mast angle is set to 45. Bring the depth slider down until it forms a point. Notice how there are now 8 facets being cut rather than 4, as would be the case in a basic symmetry. It looks more complicated, but each facet is the result of our index gear being divided into 4 symmetric parts, starting at the base index and offset on either side by the mirror amount set here. Changing the base index now simply offsets all the facets. Changing the symmetry results in more or less facets being cut around the index gear's axis of rotation. And changing mirror results in each set of 2 facets being spaced closer or further apart.